Hey everyone, it's DeagleBeagle, and today we're going to go over the VGC 23 top tier Pokemon and the best Tera types for those Pokemon. Now, there are a lot of different good Tera types for these Pokemon, and some Pokemon I'm not kind of sure about, like Baxcalibur, what the best Tera is, because I need to use that Pokemon more. I think it depends on your team, and it's a case by case basis. It's not just that individual Pokemon; it's the team. And top tier Pokemon I normally define are Pokemon that are consistently good on every team without needing much support from allies. So basically, you don't need much synergy usually for those Pokemon to be good. They're just good on. They're kind of slappable on almost any team and do fairly well. General trend: half of the Mons likely should use a stab Tera, and the other half should use an unstab one. There's actually an incentive to use an unstab Tera because if you use a stab Tera, it doesn't increase it by 50%. It increases it by 1/3. So it goes from 50% to 2 times instead of 2.25 times. So there is a drop off in how much power you can have with your stab moves. They probably did that on purpose to balance it out. But it means that you are encouraged to have offensive coverage, and I guess you could call it defensive coverage as well sometimes. That's why you see so many unstabbed Teras, but sometimes for the really offensive Pokemon people want to use, like Fluttermane, it's usually Tera Fairy. So we'll go through all that. Ones with good defensive typing are less likely to need an unstabbed Tera. Stab Teras don't do 50% more, they do 1/3 more. So that's the math. The asterisk means Tera types that are most ideal overall. Usually I put them all the way to the left on the PowerPoint, even though these types depend on your team and the current meta. Having a Tera that walls more than just one of their moves is increasingly becoming apparent and needed than before, when you only needed to wall one of their moves more likely. The ones listed are not a complete list, but will list most of the good options. So, grass and fire are probably the most common Tera types along with ghost, because grass and fire are good versus many different moves to wall them defensively and or ignore them, or offensively sometimes steel in general for resistances. If you don't know what to run, Tera Grass tends to be good for preventing sporing going through redirection. Fire is also good in general on physical bonds that are affected by Will-O-Wisp. It's just good defensive typing in general too, being resistant to fairy and stuff that's very common. Ghost blocks fake out and extreme speed, for example. Those are very common priority moves that you would be immune to. Extreme speed, I guess, is not extremely common, but extremely common extreme speed. Well, there is a lot of Arcanine and Dragonite, but, well, yeah, it's fairly common. I mean, maybe not as common as Fake Out. Well, Fake Out's even kind of dropping off for how common it is, because all the Indeedee and stuff. Stab Teras are really common. Teras that super affect the meta are common. Think about it this way: if you use a Tera for coverage, if you have a chance to super affect a Pokemon that you wouldn't super affect with your other two stab moves, then you could do more damage, possibly with like a second or third type, offensively and defensively, in a sense. So Pokemon that are top tier are on this list, and I've even seen a Steel Tera Moongus that might be useful for freeze dry. So Rock might not be the best one anymore. We'll see, but Steel though is weak to the same thing that Grass is weak to, fire. So I don't know about that one. I don't normally recommend Teras that have the same exact type or the same weakness as one of your original typings, because you want to change it so that you mess them up. Otherwise, they could just know it's not going to do any less damage and just Flare Blitz your Amoonguss if it's steel. But it would be better versus Freeze Dry. So sometimes it's worth having something like that. But I still think Rock usually is the best. Terra type with Amoonguss, a lot of people use water, but that's weak to Freeze Dry, which is very common now. It didn't used to be that common. And it gets the special defense boost in sand, and it resists flying, which is flying and fire are probably the most common moves to super effect Amoonguss. Maybe now it's increasingly becoming freeze dry, so that might change, but there's still a lot of Arcanine and stuff. Annihilate, fire, the Will-O-Wisp, and resistances. Same resistances for the most part as steel, and same kind of weaknesses. So fire is probably better for the Wisp, and steel is probably more for a rain team. Arcanine, grass, Terra grass might be the best, because unless you need more offense with fire, but fire doesn't help you defensively and only helps you a little bit offensively. Maybe, maybe not, but I would probably, in general, in Pokemon, you should be using Terrastalls that are good both defensively and offensively, or prioritize normally defense over offense, unless you are running hard trick room or a team that has follow me support or whatever. Then maybe you can focus more on offense. Like I was using Flutter Mane Mousehold, so I figured I'm going to use a stab Tera with like a fairy one. And Arcanine's not used like that typically, so I don't normally think it should run fire, but not to be closed-minded, because sometimes fire is better. And Armarouge probably should be using Psychic for expanding force, but if you really need to set up Trick Room or something, then I could see a different Tera, like a defensive Tera. But I would just recommend Psychic. Do as much damage with expanding force as possible, because you have follow me support. You should be able to hopefully wall them and set up Trick Room, but maybe not. Azumarill, Terra Water is pretty good for the Aqua Jet and other reasons, doing more with liquidation to like Garganical, whatnot, but you could use other ones. Excalibur, that's like the only Pokemon where I don't know what the best Terra is on it. But I would imagine it would either be a stab one, or it would be some really good defensive one that complements its defensive typing. So it's weak to what? Fighting. It's not weak to fire. It's weak to steel. And it's weak to steel, fighting, dragon, and fairy. I believe that's 4 of them. So if you use fairy, it would only be weak to poison and steel. So it'd still be weak to steel, but you would be not weak to anything else besides poison. And that would be a pretty good typing. Water would be pretty good because it resists electric and grass before you Terrastall. So water is probably the best defensive one, but electric could be good also. Actually, electric might be better. Maybe. It's hard to say. Yeah, electric only has one weakness, so electric and water are about the same. Dragon or ice would give it more power. It just depends. There might be some other Terras I'm missing out on too for Excalibur. It's kind of weird. I think that's probably the most diverse Terrastall Pokemon, because it's like there's so many advantages of running it different ways. I think it ultimately depends on your team and how you're using Excalibur. If you're using Dragon Dance, even on the Dragon Dance set, you could run something other than Ice or Dragon, but I might be more inclined to run either Dragon or Ice if I'm using Dragon Dance with it. But maybe not. Maybe you want it more defensive to wall something if you're setting up Dragon Dance. It's really hard to say. I need more experience with Excalibur. I know it's a really good Pokemon. It's just I haven't used it that much, because it's not my style. It's Well, it's fine. It's a great Pokemon. It's just it doesn't outspeed everything I want to outspeed, and you have to kind of use Dragon Dance, and I don't know. It's just I'm not normally into setting up Dragon Dances personally. Okay, the next one is Dondozo. Turd Dragon might be the best still, but that might not even be true because it's since everyone uses it now, it's not nearly as good as it used to be because they know they could just say their fairy Pokemon in the back or whatever and use certain typings to beat it. But Dragon is pretty good defensively and it gets a stab order up, so it just depends really. Dragon's not necessarily the best. It depends on your team, like everything on this list. Dawn Fan's not used a lot, but I think it's barely top tier. It might be taken off my top tier list soon though, because people are actually trying to counter ground Pokemon by using Tera Grass, Iron Hand and stuff. So I might take off Donphan pretty soon, but we'll see. High horsepower is pretty good. Tera Ground is good with Donphan because you can use Lum with it, and it has sturdy, so you don't even need Sash. So you could just run Lum with Terra Ground or Misty Terrain with it or whatever. If you, I mean, you could run Terra Fire with it if you're worried about Wisp and you don't want to run Lum or Misty Terrain. But then, what are you gonna run on it? Like Band? I guess you could run Band with it or what? Clear Amulet. I mean, you might as well just go ban. I mean, well, actually, no. Ban is probably a bad move because you want to use Ice Shard. That's like a huge niche of Donphan. So yeah, you'd probably want Clear Amulet, but then that item doesn't help you unless you're intimidated. So I don't know. I would probably just use, like I said, Terra Ground with Lum, and then Dragapult. Dragon Fairy Fire. Dragon is probably the best, the special one or the physical one. And Dragonite normal for the extreme speed. Flesh Cinder should probably have a Flying Terra unless you use some weird defensive one, but you would probably want to boost your own Brave Bird sometimes, especially since it could have priority. You might need it to finish something off. And then Farig Giraffe probably should use Fairy because it has good complementary typing with its dark and bug weakness. So it also boosts up Dazzling Gleam. So I don't know of many other Terras that would be good with Farig Giraffe. Perhaps, what am I thinking of? I was thinking of maybe Poison that resists some of the things it's weak to, but no, not enough. Fairy would be better. And then Fluttermane, Fairy is probably the best Terra type because they can use an offensive one, especially if you pair like Mouse Hold or Redirection or something. But I've seen some people use like Steel or Fire maybe defensively. So it's up to you. And then I probably wouldn't use normal because it's not going to be resistant to anything. If you're going to use a defensive Terra, you might want to resist something. But normal would make it take 0 damage from Shadow Ball, and if they're locked into a Shadow Ball, especially, would screw them over. Okay, Fluttermane. I already went over. Glade should probably be Terra Fire for the Wisp and stuff and defensive typing. But if you're using Sash or something anyways, you could use Fighting or Psychic. It's still weak to Wisp though, so use it at your own risk. A Garchomp Ground is probably the best Terra because you usually need to power up ground moves as hard as possible. But if you need a defensive typing or some offensive coverage, you could use maybe Fire with a Terra Blast or whatever. Help against the fairy moves. You might want to actually, well, you for sure probably shouldn't use Dragon because there's too many fairy moves used probably for Dragon to be good. But I figured it's a stab, I'll just list it. Garganical, believe it or not, I don't think Poison's that good because it's still weak to ground and ground's pretty common, and they can use a single target ground move a lot with like Headlong Rush or High Horsepower Dawn Fan, Mudstale High Horsepower. Maybe it's not super common, but it's becoming more common now because people keep seeing these poison Tera Garganicles. I don't know why people run it still. It's okay, but Ghost is better. I guarantee it, dude. Yes, it depends on the team, but still. And then Gastrodon, Tera Fire might be the best one because it uses its Storm Drain to be immune to water moves and it resists freeze dry and whatnot. So not bad. Gengar, Tera Poison is probably the best. It depends. Because Tera Poison helps you kill the fairy Pokemon easier, and that gives it a huge niche that other Pokemon don't have. Because there's hardly any poison Pokemon in the format. And if you're just trying to boost up its ghost move, it's like, well, Fluttermane could probably do that better than Gengar. So use what its uniqueness to its advantage, I normally recommend. And then Goldenga should almost always have Terra Steel to boost up that Make It Rain. But I suppose you could use like Flying or something instead defensively. And then Glabora probably should be Grass, but you could use Flying, Poison, or Rock. Great Tusk should probably use Fire for the Wisp, and then rely on teammates for deterring Intimidate with Define or Competitive or whatever, or it can use like Clear Amulet or Band or something maybe. But you probably want Sash on it because it's not very bulky on the special side, especially if you use Headlong Rush or Close Combat. And then Grimmsnarl Tera Fire is pretty good defensively versus not mostly Wisp, even though that it could be what it's for, because it is a physical attacker, but mostly for fairy moves. And Gyarados probably should be using Tera Flying for Tera Blast, even though it could use other offensive or defensive moves. Tera types, I mean, for the moves. And then Hatterene, I used to use Tera Fairy with it, and it was really good for powering it up in Hard Trick Room, but with all the Wide Guard and stuff, and not even surviving, like, I sometimes need to get a second Trick Room up or the first Trick Room set up with Hatterene, so Tera Fire is actually really good defensive typing, complementary to what it's weak to. It's weak to, like, Ghost and Steel, and you aren't weak to those if you Tera Fire. And then Hydreigon is Fire. See, it's just a good defensive Tera in general, and being a Wisp is just really helpful. And then Hydreigon might want to be Fire because that's a lot of times Heat Wave, but it depends on your team. And then Iron Bundle probably wants to be Tera Water to wall the Make It Rains, especially if you're not Sash with Iron Bundle. But also just boosting up the Hydro Pump could be good. But Tera Ice is good too for Freeze Dry, especially since Hydro Pump can miss. Iron Hands, Grass is probably the best because it counters what people normally use to kill it. But if they don't use a ground move to kill it, then Steel would be pretty good versus almost everything else. And then Iron Jugulus, Flying is probably the best because you probably want to use spam Hurricane with it. To me, that's its main niche. If you're not using Hurricane with it, I don't think it's worth using, personally. I'm trying to think of how else you would use it. Maybe Assault Vest to counter Indeedee Armorage, but there's better things for that. Probably. Maybe not. Grass is probably the best Tera for Iron Moth. Good defensive typing. It helps with its offensive energy ball. Iron Treads, Fire for the Wisp. Fairy typing, Tera type for the Indeedee if you're using Dazzling Gleam, or even if you're not, it's good complementary defensive typing to what it's weak to, like Dark and stuff it resists. And then Lycan Rock, you probably want to use Rock with it. Maybe Fire for Will-O-Wisp, but Rock just makes sense. It only has one type, and usually when there's only one type, maybe not usually, but a lot of times you want to boost up that move because it doesn't have two moves for coverage, it just has one. one stab move, so you might want to just boost that one up. Mouse hold. Oh, I forgot to put an asterisk on it. Let me do that really quick. Um, Ghost is probably the best by far overall, but it depends. Sometimes Fairy's better versus like dragon moves and stuff. And then Meta can't and Fire might be good if, but probably not with all its if you use a lot of speed with it. So you might outspeed before their Wisp. Metacam Psychic might be the best because you normally don't need more attack. You don't need more power with the fighting moves. It's usually with the whatever you use, Zen Headbutt or Psycho Shock with it that you need a little bit more power with. And then Meowscarada might want to use Grass because Flower Trick is its main selling point. And then Mimikyu, and it has Sash anyway, so it doesn't need good defensive typing. I pretty much put as an option Fire on every physical Pokemon that can be Wisps, just as an option for that. But I don't know about that for Meowscarada. Mimikyu, Fairy is probably the best, but Ghost is common too. Yeah, and I said Fire. And Murkrow, you're not going to really... You could use a different Tera than Ghost, actually. Like Fire or something to resist the Fairy moves that might super affect you. But typically you don't need to keep Murkrow alive that much once you get the Tailwind up. Unless you're trying to conserve it with Haze. But normally you just want Ghost sometimes, so you can use it with Goldengo or whatever and be able to deter Ghost Tailwind when you need it, or just not get Fake Out in general to use something else. And then Pelipper should probably be using Terra Grass because you could just use Sash with it and it won't matter that much if it's weak to the same thing as its other typing with Freeze Dry. But if you're not using Sash, you might want to use something else besides Grass. I highly recommend like Steel or something, because if you use Steel, it's not weak to Fire because it has the Rain Up, and it's good complementary typing because they're probably not going to use a ground move on you when you started out as a part flying Pokemon. So it's just really good all around. But ground's good too because they might try to Thunderbolt you or something. Pincurchin. So that Pokemon probably should be using Terra Electric, but I suppose you could defensively use Flying or something, or Water for offensive coverage with Hydro Pump or Surf. It's weird, I didn't even think about Surf, I just thought about Hydro Pump. And then Roaring Moon, Fire is probably the best because you wall a Dazzling Gleam and you can hopefully have good offensive coverage with it versus some things like Amoonguss or whatever. And then Sableye should probably use Terrafire defensively because you're probably not going to want to boost up your offense because it's so weak at that. And then Salamence, you probably would want a defensive Terra on all the very weak Pokemon unless they're really fragile and have Sash or something. Like Salamence, probably should use Steel or Fire to resist Fairy. So I say Fire if it's physical, and then Steel might be a little bit better if it's pure special. But if you're physical, you don't want to get burned. And Sandy Shocks is probably best with Grass mostly because you hit through the Rage Powder, but also because you can't be put asleep or be hit by a ground move or a water move is hard. So that would be pretty good. Ice is good offensively though. Scissor. Now, Fire and Water are equally good. It depends on your team. Fire by itself is better, but if you're using it Scissor with the Rain team, then you could use Terra Water and Lum to get rid of the Will-O-Wisp, and it would do pretty well. Terra Water Blast against it, Arcanine or whatever. And then Spiritomb, use probably Terra Grass to deter a Spore or deal with it, because it's not going to have powerful moves anyways. Might as well use a defensive Tera. And then Sylveon, Tera Fire would be really good because it's good defensively and offensively. Ground would be the best offensive coverage with Fairy, so you could use that, but then you may not resist very many things that are trying to kill Sylveon. So I don't think I would normally recommend ground. I think water and fire are better because, well, water for the Calm Mind one is really good, but fire is pretty good. Even though everyone's trying to counter fire Pokemon, uh, like ground types are pretty common. I would expect Tyranitar to be more common. And then maybe water Pokemon, but water Pokemon aren't that reliable because of the Gastrodon stuff. So probably mostly just use rock and ground moves for all the Tera fires. And Rod Wash, that Pokemon, since it has Levitate, you might want to just use Tera Electric. You boost up one of your stabs anyways, and you still have no weakness. You have no weakness if you use Tera Electric, so it's probably the best Tera type. There's other good Tera types like waters and stuff too, but I just think Tera Electric's usually the best. It's done pretty well in tournaments too. And then Talonflame Flying, probably for the. I thought I showed Talonflame already. Maybe I was Flesh Ender. Uh, Talonflame should use probably Tera Flying for the Brave Bird, but I could see a defensive Tera being used also, or Tera Ghost to ensure that it gets up a Tailwind versus Fake Out. So Tatsugiri could use Dragon Tera. That's pretty good for Scarf or whatever. Tauros, Fire is probably the best to help get some of those kills with Choice Band versus some things like Sylveon, that bulky Sylveon that it couldn't one shot otherwise. And then Tauros Water, well, water might be the best. It gets rid of its weaknesses that it shares with the fighting half type, or half of its fighting. And then Torkoal, probably fire's the best because you want to maximize your fire output, especially if you get Trick Room up, or even if you don't, just doing as much damage as possible. A defensive Tera is probably not going to help it enough to make it worth it when it gets outsped. Maybe. Well, I don't know. Probably not. And then Tyranitar, believe it or not, I think Psychic's the best because Flying is perhaps better in some ways defensively, but versus, let's say, an Iron Hands, if you Tera Flying, then you're weak to Wild Charge, and you don't even super effect Iron Hands, which is a very common threat for Tyranitar. So I kind of prefer Tera Psychic, especially if you use Indeedee. It just does a lot of damage. Helps with some Moongus and stuff too. Volcarona, probably should use Tera Grass. It is just really good with Giga Drain. If it didn't have Giga Drain, then you might want to use something else. But overall, Tera Grass is good to resist things that otherwise would hit it hard neutrally, like a physical attack like Earthquake. And just, it's mostly, I think, for Giga Drain though, to restore more HP. So hopefully you found this video useful. Stay tuned for more videos.